joining today's session. My name is Walt Goodfield with RKL Solutions. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Doug Hart. Doug is a solution architect here at RKL Solutions. He's been in the industry for quite some time and has very practical, real-world experience as a controller in a privately held manufacturing and distribution company. He brings a wealth of experience when it comes to the accounting and manufacturing concepts, and especially useful for the year-end topics that we're going to talk about today. If you're new to RKL, perhaps you work with Gia Lane or Rachel Roselli. Each of them are customer account managers here at RKL, and their primary concern is to help you with any questions that you may have at RKL. They're not here to answer specific support questions or engage in services and projects, but we do have a vast team here, and if you need some help escalating or working through the different contacts, both of them are dedicated specifically to you to help you navigate our infrastructure. Gia on the East Coast, primarily the states bordering the Atlantic, and Rachel everything kind of mid-Atlantic westward onto California. Again, without further delay, I want to hand it over to Doug, and Doug will walk you through a couple slides here on tips, tricks, and best practices for closing the year with Sage 500. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, Walt. So I really wanted to break today's session down into two chunks, if you will. One being, what do we need to do to wrap up things in the 2015 year before we move forward? And then how do we get ready for 2016? So I've outlined on this first slide just a quick overview of what the agenda will be for today's session. We're going to talk a little bit about disaster recovery plans. We're going to cover the basics of physical inventory, reviewing 1099 payments to your vendors, and then the opportunities available for purging or pruning data from your 500 database. Once we've covered all those, we'll move into the things that we need to be concerned about to get ready for the new year, creating a new GL year, creating a new inventory calendar, and for those folks who are working with Sage Fixed Assets, some considerations for that utility, as well as taking a look at updating user security groups within 500. So hopefully you know what a disaster recovery plan is. If you don't, then hopefully this will give you a short education. There's a motivational speaker by the name of Dennis Watley who said, expect the best, plan for the worst, and prepare to be surprised. Disaster recovery plans are intended to minimize those surprises. So these disaster recovery plans are put in place to try and get you back up and running as quickly as possible in the event of some sort of a catastrophe, whether that be a hurricane, a fire, whatnot. And a disaster recovery plan has some basics that we want to make sure that you've got covered in your particular plan. So you want to obviously look at replacement hardware and logistics if you need to relocate people to new office space and set up new servers. You want to ensure that you've got good communication across the organization for what these disaster recovery plans include. You want to ensure that you've got a current contact list with the people that are necessary for individual components within that disaster recovery plan, and their secondary contact information, whether that be a mobile number or whatnot, or an additional email address if the work email happens to be down. And then obviously a list of tasks that need to occur in order for you to implement the plan, whether that be, again, setting up remote sites, setting up remote servers, getting new logins squared away, all of those particulars. There are also a few things that we want to look at, particularly in the Sage 500 space, which uses a SQL database on the back end. And those include looking at the SQL Server's recovery model for your database. I don't want to get very technical on this call, but know that there are 3 different recovery models available for a SQL database: simple, full, and bulk log. And depending on which of those recovery models your database is currently using will trigger the process that you need to go through for recovering that database if you needed to get your 500 database up and running on a new server or recover from a backup. We also want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of how you're managing that backup media. Today you can back up to tape drives. You may simply have backup files stored either locally on your SQL server or on some other server on your domain, or maybe that backup media, whether it be tapes or those files, are being sent off-site to further ensure their recoverability in the event that something happens at your site. So you just want to make sure that you've got a good understanding of how those backups are being done, where they're being stored, and how they can be accessed. You also want to be sure that you've tested any SQL backup and recovery procedures that you have. It's not enough to simply set up a database maintenance plan when you first create your 500 implementation and then walk away and forget it. Computers have, unfortunately, a history of having hiccups every now and then, and things change over time, including perhaps directory locations where files get stored and whatnot. So you want to make sure that you're doing a periodic test of your database backup and restore procedures to make sure that when push comes to shove, you've got the ability to get that data back when needed. So let's start talking about some of the specifics within 500 itself. For the folks who are on the call that happen to use either the inventory distribution or manufacturing modules within 500, physical inventory is likely something that you're doing at least on a periodic basis, if not at least annually. And I want to walk through the basics of tackling that physical inventory, especially for those folks who may only do it once a year. So the first step in doing your physical inventory within 500 is deciding which items you want to count. Each physical count batch is going to be tied to a specific warehouse, but within that warehouse, you've got a lot of filtering options that you can pick and choose from to determine which items you want to count. If you're not simply taking the shotgun approach and selecting everything, you've got the opportunity to select items based on item type, the item status, zone locations, and so forth. So once you've decided which items that you want to count, the next step is to do a freeze, which is just a real quick step from that batch task menu. And then once you've frozen those items, you have to determine what method you're going to give to the folks who are actually out counting on the floor in the warehouse those items. Are you going to generate count cards, which have typically a single item and bin location on one card? Or are you going to hand out count sheets, which may have multiple items, multiple bin locations, all on a single piece of paper? In either case, you're going to have the ability when you go to the print count cards or count sheets to add either blank cards or blank lines to the count sheets. And that gives you the opportunity to have a placeholder in the system for any items that you may find in the warehouse that were either not originally included in your count by mistake, or that may be in a different bin location than you expected to find them in, or that the system expected to find them in, so that you can add those items into the physical count entry. Once the counts have physically been done and those are either turned into the office personnel who are going to be keying them or turned into the warehouse manager who may be keying them, you do have a couple of options within the enter count tasks that you want to consider. One is that you've got the ability to show the user who is entering those counts from those sheets or cards the quantity that was frozen when you started the process. So do you want that user to be counting blind, if you will, or do you want them to know what you expected to find as they're entering that count? Also in that entry screen for entering the counts, the user has the option to show only the items that have been counted so far, only those items that have not yet been counted, or to display all. So it can give you give the user some quick visibility into seeing what has not yet been counted by selecting that uncounted option to know what work they still have ahead of them. In newer versions of 500, you've got a grid-based data entry for the enter counts task. And if you have the data porter module, you can also use an Excel sheet to upload that information through a data porter import directly into that grid, which can help speed up the data entry process. Regardless of whether you're using cards or sheets, you do have the option to generate a list of missing count cards. And just keep in mind that within the tasks for fiscal count process, there is an option to set all uncounted items to 0. If you do that, it's going to treat that item as having been counted, but with a 0 count. So if you want to be able to run the list of missing count cards, those for which you have not yet entered data, then you want to be sure not to use this set uncounted to 0 option within the enter counts task. Once you've got your data entered, there are a couple of reports that will help you to digest and process that data, and one is the reconciliation report. That report is going to show you any inventory transactions that have posted since the items that were selected and frozen were frozen. So as you're doing your physical counts, there may be transactions still processing through the system, whether those be shipments to customers, receipts of goods from your vendors, and so forth. So this reconciliation report will give you that list of transactions that may have happened since the count was frozen so that you can accommodate those during your count entry process. There's also a discrepancy report that can come in handy. In maintain inventory, there is a tolerance % field when you're assigning an item to a warehouse. And if you've populated that field with a tolerance %, this discrepancy report will show you the items that you have entered a count for, and the variance between the frozen count and the entered count is equal to or greater than that tolerance % that's defined in maintain inventory. So if you want to set some thresholds to be able to identify large discrepancies, this is the way to do it. Okay. Just a note regarding 1099 payments. Typically, Sage will produce a standalone update for 1099s, which will only affect the reports and the tasks that directly tie to the 1099 generation process. This year, however, the IRS has enacted the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, and because of that, there's an additional field that needs to be added to the maintain vendors task. So if you have any customizations to maintain vendors, we're going to need to keep that in mind if we need to update your 1099 applications within 500. Now, Sage normally publishes the 1099 update as a standalone update in mid-December. It has not been released yet, at least it had not as of yesterday, but I would expect it to be out very shortly. And since it is a standalone, it will only include objects that modify the actual 1099 report, the 1099 generation tasks, and as I mentioned, the maintain vendors task in this case. Sage will also include all of those changes in the next product update, which will typically get released in January for all supported versions of 500. And Sage is currently supporting versions 7.4 and higher. So version 7.4, version 2013, and version 2014 should all be getting the standalone 1099 updates, as well as having that information included in the January product updates. I've also included in the PowerPoint some links here to IRS instructions if you need to get specifics from the IRS requirements for either your 1099 miscellaneous, 1099 interest, or 1099 dividend payments. Within 500 itself, underneath the Accounts Payable Activities menu, there's a separate folder for editing 1099 data, and you've got a couple of tasks included underneath that subfolder. The first is editing voucher 1099 data, and you would use that in the event that you had processed a payment to a vendor, and at the time that you processed that payment, that vendor was not set up to be a 1099 reportable vendor, and therefore the voucher did not get triggered as a 1099 reportable voucher. This allows you to open up that voucher and specify the 1099 payment amount that may relate to that voucher. The IRS 1099 corrections task you would only use if you had submitted your 1099s electronically and the IRS has kicked back a notice to you that they had rejected that submission based on some criteria. Either you've got an incorrect taxpayer ID number, incorrect payee name, something along those lines. So if you get notified by the IRS that you have a problem with the with the 1099s that were submitted electronically, this is the task that you would use to make the corrections and then resubmit that data back to the IRS. Thirdly, the 1099 beginning balances task. If you migrated from some other ERP system during 2015, or if you had issued payments to vendors outside of 500 during 2015, and therefore those payment records are not in 500 itself, you can use the 1099 beginning balances task to record the amounts that were paid outside of the 500 system check or 500 manual check process. In terms of being able to review the data that you have relating to 1099s, there are a couple of standard Explore views that give you some of the information. There's an Explore Vendors task, which is standard in 500, but unfortunately that doesn't give you 1099 type information for the vendor. And there's an Explore Vendor Payments task, but unfortunately that task doesn't have any 1099 data related to it. We've had clients ask in the past, and we have developed a custom Explore task that pulls all the information relating to vendors, payments, and 1099s together in a single Explore view and includes up to 3 years of payment history. So if that's something that's of interest to you, you can reach out to your Sage 500 consultant or to Gia or to Rachel to be able to get a quote for that custom Explore view, and hopefully that would help simplify the process for you to review the payments made. And then lastly, of course, we've got the option to actually print or generate the 1099s once we've reviewed all of the data and ensured that we've captured the right 1099 information for each vendor and for each payment to those vendors. Then we can actually use this task, which is going to be located off the Accounts Payable Insights Report menu. There's a separate 1099 Reports submenu underneath the Report menu. And it gives you the option there to either print them to pre-printed forms. Those pre-printed forms you'd want to pick up at any of your local office supply places. Or you can submit the file electronically to the IRS. And again, just a note here that the 1099 updates should be available any day now as a standalone and will be available in the next product update. Okay, so what can we get rid of in 500? What can we purge, what can we prune to try and reduce size of tables on disk and so forth? Each module has a post batches task where the pending batches for that module exist until they've been posted through. So it's a good practice to get in the habit of checking that each time you do a monthly close, if you're doing a period close, but particularly at year end, to see if there are any old pending batches sitting out there that need to either be deleted or processed through. In addition, each module has a setup options task, which includes a data retention field or fields. And that data retention information will allow you to keep track of additions, changes, and deletions to that particular module, as well as a log file for all of those changes. So in accounts payable, for example, you've got the ability to record additions, changes, and deletions to the vendor master records, so the list of vendors and so forth. Each of those fields has a number of months or a number of years for which it will normally retain that data. If you do use any of the modules process period and purge data options, the purge will look back to that module's setup options to see what the data retention terms are to determine whether or not some piece of data is old enough for you to purge. So if you've got the data retention set to 84 months for accounts payable, if you do the purge in accounts payable process period end, it will check to see that data is 84 months old or older before it would consider purging it. Having said that, there are some concerns about those purge utilities within 500. Due to the way that they were written, they can be a little frustrating to work with. If you happen to have a large data set, it could take obviously a considerable amount of time for the routine to process through to determine what can be purged. It will then go through and try to purge those records, but if a single record fails in that process, unfortunately you won't know it until it goes through all of them, hits the failure, and then rolls back everything that it had successfully purged up to that point, or successfully had ready to purge up to that point. So you may find that you would go into one of these modules, purge options, have it run for hours, and at the end of those hours, it would come back and tell you that it didn't do anything. So they can be a little frustrating, although in the 2016 release, Sage has reworked the inventory purge in particular, and hopefully that will be a godsend for folks going forward. Keep in mind the order of closing modules when you're doing either a period end close or your year-end close. Should be handling all the subsidiary modules first, and in specific order they would be tackling the inventory close first, then accounts payable, which also closes PO, then accounts receivable, which also closes sales order, then cash management, multi-currency, and GL would be the last module that you would close. Now, separate from those module period and processing purge options, there are a handful of purge utilities within some of the modules. So in purchase order, sales order, manufacturing, and system manager, there are some purge utilities which are normally safe to run should you decide that you want to get rid of some old historical data. Each of these options or each of these tasks gives you the option to purge data older than a number of months that you specify when you run the task. So if you wanted to remove closed POs older than, let's say, 84 months or 36 months, closed receivers and returns older than 24 months, closed requisitions older than 12 months, you've got the flexibility to do that for each individual task that's listed here. And in System Manager, there are a few logs that record activity such as period end processing, running module purges, security changes within 500, and so forth. That activity log can also be purged based on a specified number of months. This is also a good time to take a look at any users who may have left the company in the last year and setting them to be deleted or inactive within 500. Keep in mind that since 500 uses SQL as its underlying database, the SQL login will live on even if you've flagged the user as no longer being a user within 500. So if you truly want to rid yourself of that user ID, you would not only need to flag the record and maintain users within 500, but also delete the user login from the SQL server as well. You can reach out to either your local database administrator or reach out to RKL for assistance if you need to on that. There are also some demo data companies that may have been installed when your 500 implementation was performed. If you see company IDs like SOA, COA, CAD, those are all demo companies that ship with the software. If you have no need for those, if they're not useful for you and you want to get rid of them, you can delete them through the Maintain Companies task. Just keep in mind a couple of things. As with any of the purge routines, anytime you want to remove data from the system, you want to ensure that you've got a backup before you do. So ensure that you've got a good SQL backup that has been tested, that you know that you can restore back from before you go ahead and run any of the purge utilities or do any of the company deletions. Also keep in mind that if any of the demo data companies that you wish to get rid of have intercompany transactions posting to other demo data companies, you will get blocked from removing those companies because it cannot remove the record from the other company that you cannot tell it to delete at the same time. So if you have any struggles with deleting demo data companies, again, RKL has some tools that we can deploy on your behalf to take care of those interdependencies. This is also a time where if you have an on-site database administrator or if you're working with somebody from RKL who understands the table structure well, there may be some specific tables where we could truncate specific records from, so remove specific records from. And a couple of the tables that are safe to do that are listed here. The TSO pick list table is the table that's used to generate pick lists for your shipments. Obviously, there are some rules we have to throw around deleting from that table. We don't want to delete records from that table that are currently in use on open picks. But if the pick has been fulfilled and shipped and the shipment is committed and it's old, we can wrap some rules around that to be able to remove some records from that table. The TCI DB activity log is sort of an audit trail table within 500 that keeps track of updates made within the SQL code. Excuse me, not within the SQL code. We're using SQL tools rather than updates that happen throughout normal data entry processes within 500. So if you've got imports that were done, SQL scripts that have updated tables, those sorts of things get captured in that TCI DB activity log. Some other best practices to consider. This is the time of year typically when folks are looking at their budgets for the coming year. So you've got a couple of different options within 500 for maintaining budgets. There is a maintain budgets task off the maintenance folder in General Ledger, and there's also a revise budgets task off the activities menu in General Ledger. The primary difference between those two is the maintain budgets task is intended for you to be focused on a single account at a time where you can change the values for the budget for all of the periods within the current year for that single account. The revise budgets task is typically where you would go if you wanted to update budgets for multiple accounts, ranges of accounts, and so forth. And the revise budgets task also does require you to go through a register post process, unlike the maintain budgets task where you can simply type in the grid the new amount that you want to record for the budget and save the screen and you're done. Both of these tasks allow you to deploy some rules for the budgets that you're changing. So you can copy data from an existing budget to a new budget. And when you do that copy, you've got a few choices in terms of either copying from your current year actual balances, some other budget. Also, when you're doing that copy, you've got the ability to do either a markup or a markdown by a specified percent or a specified dollar amount. So there is some flexibility in being able to create those new budgets based off of, let's say, last year plus 5%. End of year is also a good time for you to look through your inventory replenishment defaults. If you're using min-max as your replenishment method, then you want to just review those minimum and maximum stock levels to make sure that those are still accurate for you going forward. If you're using something more complex like EOQ, then you'll want to take a look at the various formulas and purchase requirements that your vendors may have to make sure that those get factored in for calculations for the coming year. Speaking of vendors, there is a purchase order vendor performance report, and that report can be run by vendor, by warehouse, by item, and it can include statistics or metrics based on data that you have the option to enter when you're doing receipts of goods and receipt of invoice. Both receipt of goods and receipt of invoice tasks have vendor performance criteria like did they deliver on time, did they deliver damaged goods, did they deliver to the correct address. There are several attributes that you can check off and notes that you can add in both receipt of goods and receipt of invoice tasks in the purchase order module, and those kinds of metrics are what's included on this vendor performance report. So it's a great tool to use to sit down with your vendor and to either negotiate or renegotiate purchasing contracts. If you're a manufacturing company, then this is also the right time for you to be looking at your overhead rates that you're applying, variances from standard cost, and considering a bill of material cost roll-up to update standard costs for your bills of material. So that's all the topics we have in terms of closing out the previous year. What do we need to be concerned with for setting up 2016? The first thing you're going to need is to make sure that you've got the General Ledger fiscal calendar set up for 2016. So underneath GL maintenance, there's a GL setup folder, and underneath that there's a setup fiscal calendar task. If you go into that task, there's a drop-down field for the fiscal year, and you can see what years have already been created. Oftentimes, consultants, when they're doing a new implementation, may create several years ahead for you so that you don't have to worry about this. But if you've been implemented long ago, you may not have these future years set up anymore, so this is the way that you would go in and create that new year. There's an Add Year button in that task, and it'll simply add 1 to the highest year that it already has and create the new year based off of the same period end dates as your previous year. You'll want to make sure that you confirm the start date and end date for each period. And if you're in a newer version of 500, you're also going to have the ability to toggle the lock module, so lock AP, lock AR, lock cash management, lock inventory, lock manufacturing. You can do that individually by module, individually by period, or lock unlock all modules for a given period. You also, once you try to save this screen to add the new year, will get prompted that beginning balances for General Ledger will be created, and just note that that may take a minute or so to run through. It's probably a good idea not to have folks posting transactions in General Ledger when you go out and have the balances recalculated, just to avoid any potential conflicts in the data. Like setting up a GL year, inventory, if you're using the inventory module, also maintains its own inventory calendar, and that inventory calendar is actually maintained within the Setup IM Options task itself. There's a miscellaneous tab on that task, which has an inventory calendar button, and again, you'll be able to click an Add Year button there to be able to add a new year. It also has a field for number of workdays in the period. That workdays field is used by the replenishment's demand and safety stock formulas. So if you're using something like EOQ and you're using formulas for demand and for safety stock, then you want to make sure that that number of workdays per period is accurate. I think it defaults to either 20 or 22 days for most months. So you just want to take a look at that, and if you're working 7 days a week at your operation, then obviously you'll want to update those. Again, before running any of these tasks like the GL fiscal year setup, the inventory fiscal year setup, where they're going out and recalculating balances, it's a good idea to have a backup beforehand. You can't have too many backups as far as I'm concerned. And like the GL process, when you go to save the new inventory year, it will go through and recalculate the inventory balances. And this can take substantially longer than the GL recalculation. So this is something that you want to make sure that you've got some time set aside for if you've got a large data set to make sure that you give yourself ample time to let that process through. For folks who are using Sage Fixed Assets, if you're integrating FAS with Sage 500, then you'll want to make sure which version of FAS is supported by your version of 500. And the way to confirm that is to go to your Sage 500 version's compatibility guide. You can find that on the Sage portal, or you can reach out to RKL and we can provide you with a copy. In either case, it'll specify the most recent version of FAS that is supported with your version of 500. If you're not sure whether you are integrating Sage Fixed Assets with Sage 500, you can tell by going into Sage 500's Accounts Payable module and going into the Setup AP Options task under the AP Setup menu. There's an integration tab in that task, and if you have the Fixed Asset Accounting field checked and there's a FAS database and company name listed in those fields, that tells you that Sage 500 for that company in 500 is integrated with FAS. So you'd have to check this in each individual company in 500. If 500 and FAS are not integrated through this task, then it doesn't matter which version of FAS you're on, so you might as well be on the most current version available to make sure you get all the most current IRS regulations. And FAS version 2016 should be available on Sage's site soon. We talked a little bit earlier about checking for users who are no longer with your company. You also will want to review at this time users who may have changed responsibilities during the course of the year. And you also may want to take a look at the menu upgrade utility that ships with the software, particularly if you've upgraded recently. With each version, there are typically new tasks added to the menu. The menu upgrade utility is a tool that allows you to take tasks that are on the standard 500 menu produced by Sage and add them to any customized menu that you may have created in your environment. So if there's a new feature added by Sage to a particular module, this menu upgrade utility is the tool that allows you to quickly see, first of all of those tasks that may exist in the standard menu that don't exist in your custom menu, and then gives you the opportunity to add those to your custom menu. You'll also want to take a look at, as I said, at the 500 users' roles and responsibilities. If folks have changed responsibilities during the course of the year, then you want to take a look at their security groups and see if perhaps they may need to be removed from a particular security group for tasks that they're no longer performing, or they may need to be added to new groups for new tasks, new responsibilities that they may have. One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at 500 user group permissions is that they are inclusive, and by that I mean if a user is assigned to two security groups, one group has a permission denied, the other group has the permission allowed, that user will have the permission allowed. So it's the more generous of the options. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Walt and open up the lines for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Doug. While we were speaking, we had a couple submissions, so we'll go ahead and address those first, and then I'll unmute all lines and encourage other questions. Question number one comes back to when we were talking about the physical inventory close process. The question is, how can I generate a report that would include the dollar variances on the physical inventory discrepancy report?
So we may need to look at customizing that report to give you the dollar value there if it's not showing in the standard report. So I would reach out to your 500 consultant to take a look at that.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm not aware of a standard report that includes that, but it's something we could customize through Crystal. Great.
Yep, and we could also create an Explorer view for that as well.
Yep, okay. Question number two, if I've already closed the year in January after the close, I realize I need to make some adjustments. Can I reopen the general ledger to make an adjusting entry.
Yeah, absolutely. 500 doesn't do what's called a hard close. So if you find that you need to put in some last-minute journal entries after you've already done the close, you can go back into GL setup options and change the current period fields there back to the last period of the prior year, post through whatever adjustments that you need to, and then repeat your period end close process, whether that includes printing reports, generating new financials, and so forth. You could also do that for other subsidiary modules, but keep in mind that if you need to do that for subsidiary modules, you may have to open up multiple modules, right? So if you've got inventory transactions, they may affect sales order, they may affect receivables, they may affect payables. So you just have to keep in mind what data elements might get touched by the transaction that you're proposing, and make sure that you do it in the module that it would normally originate in.
Perfect. There are no more online submissions, Doug, so at this point I'm going to unmute all lines, and we will encourage anybody to raise their hand and ask a question. At this time, all lines are now unmuted. If you have a question, please go ahead and submit it. Okay. Last call. Any questions?
Where is the setting up the new inventory year in the setup IM options?
There's a miscellaneous tab, which I think is the last tab on the right-hand side.
Miscellaneous? Okay, I see it.
And then there's an inventory calendar button there.
Inventory calendar. Okay, you click on the inventory calendar?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Good.
And then, how do you add the 2016 year?
Give me 1 second. Let me just pop back to that screen. Okay, so if you're on that screen, it's going to bring up the most current year by default. You can click on the green checkbox that's up in your top left-hand corner, and that will set you back into the year field. And you can either type in a new year there, or when you have the previous field or the previous screen up, you can click the Copy From button to create a new year.
Okay, so you can type in the 2016 there?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Great. Any other questions? We had one more, Doug, that came in. It had to do with the 1099 view for the custom Explore task. Is there any concerns about compatibility? This customer is on version 7.4.
Not typically. Since we use these as Explore views, they're really just views into the database. So the data structure may be a little bit different for version 7.4 than it was for 7.5 or 7.6, but we can roll those out regardless of the version that you're on.
Great. At this point, if there aren't any more questions, we'll go ahead and conclude today's session. Again, on behalf of everybody here at RKL, we wish you a happy holiday. Good luck with your year-end close. And if you need help, we're here. You can either contact the support desk or you can contact the sales inbox, and we'll make sure we get it routed to the right individual. Thank you, Doug, for your presentation today. And again, thank you for your time. Good luck. Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays.
This concludes today's session.